Today I shall be doing or reading Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard with you all. It's a poem that originally had the name Stanza Wrote in a Country Churchyard, with 5 additional stanzas. As per the suggestion of William Mason, the name was changed, and during publication of the poem in 1751, 5 additional stanzas were omitted. The origin of the poem is unknown, but certain incidents that Thomas Gray witnessed perhaps forced him to write this elegy. The first and foremost of the incidents is the death of his friend Richard West in 1742. He began writing this elegy in the year 1746 when he was living near St. Giles Parish Church at Stockporges, and his mother was also buried there. Later in the year 1749, his aunt Mary Antrobus died, and Horace Walpole, his friend, luckily escapes from getting killed by 2 highwaymen. These 2 events also perhaps added fuel and made him contemplate on mortality. The poem begins with the line, "The curfew tolls the knell of parting day." The connotation of the word curfew is different from the way we understand the word in our modern usage. Curfew was a bell that was rung during the night, and this was a practice that was introduced by William the Conqueror as a fire precaution, signaling lights out. So it was a bell that marked the end of the day and the beginning of night. Now when the poet says the curfew tolls the knell of parting day, what is indicated is that this curfew is like the dead bell that is knell, for it marks the end of the day. It marks the death of the day that is leaving or dying and initiates the beginning of the night. The beginning line thus perfectly creates the mood and initiates the movement towards the theme of the poem. In the next 2 lines, the poet goes on to describe the nature and the activities that begin with the falling of the night. Line 4 is significant, for here we are introduced with the poetic persona, the speaker. The poetic persona says that the world is left behind to darkness and to him, which can be considered as an effect of curfew, nature, and decline of activities. The fact that in the 4th line the poetic persona comes up with the declaration, "and leaves the world to darkness and to me," opens up the space for 2 strains of interpretation. The first is, perhaps the poetic persona is a poet who is enjoying solitude that darkness promises, and hence with the dark as the only company, meditating over the darker side of life. He is musing in a graveyard at close of day. The second interpretation is that perhaps the poetic persona is someone who belongs to the world of darkness, of death, and hence with fall of night the world is of him and of darkness. The second interpretation thus introduces the element of horror in the form of a narrator from the world of death who is comfortable in the graveyard when darkness has enshrouded the world. This also qualifies the poem as a poem with Gothic elements. This is an important element of graveyard poetry, for along with the musings over death, elements of horror are present, which makes it a justified precursor of the Gothic genre and elements that were in vogue in the Romantic era. The next few lines presents images of fading landscape, of stillness of air, tinklings of bell, of owls sitting and complaining from ivy mantled tower, which is perhaps the church tower. In line number 15 and 16, after inking or versifying the environment and setting the mood, the dead forefathers are introduced. Each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. The adjective rude is used with the noun forefathers, not in a derogatory sense here. Rather, it indicates that these people lacked the sophistication of the city dwellers, since they were from the countryside. In the next lines, the poem reads, "The breezy call of incense-breathing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock's shrill clarion or the echoing horn." Thus, the sense presences that one enjoys in countryside are versified, and these presences are like permanent elements of the nature of world, quite unlike the forefathers who are not going to rise from their graves to enjoy the sound or the feel. In the 20th line, the narrative voice changes and a distance from the first voice who in line 4 stated his comfort in the night world with darkness can be noticed. The poet in the next lines describes the life and activity that the forefathers will not enjoy ever again, the warmth of fireplace, the evening care of the housewives, the love of their children, and their work. In the 29th line, we again notice a turn. The poet writes, "Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor." Here, the poet contrasts the grander elements of life with the simpler elements by personifying ambition and grandeur. In a didactic tone, he asks them not to mock the hard work or the homely simple pleasures or the unsung obscure destinies of the poor farmers in the graveyard. And in the lines that follows, points at the inevitable end of all the grand things of life, beauty, glory, power, along with the simpler things of life. The 11th stanza, which begins in line number 41 in an interrogative tone, presents death as an irreversible phenomenon. Can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion call the fleeting breath? Can honor's voice provoke the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull cold ear of death? The narrator is still addressing the proud ambitious readers who might have mocked the lowly farmers in the churchyard. He asks them whether the urn holding the dead person's remains, or a really lifelike bust, call the breath back to a dead person and make him breathe again. He also asks if the voice of honor can provoke the silent, dusty remains of a dead person to speak again, or whether flattery can make the cold ear of dead man feel better about being dead. Here again, flattery, honor, and death is personified. In the next lines, the poem takes a turn again where the poetic persona moves into a more imaginative plane and attempts reflecting on what type of person might be lying in the unmarked graves in the churchyard. He moves through possibilities. Perhaps the person was pious, or had the potency of ruling an empire, or had musical talent. And in the next few lines, he points at the reasons that had created differences in their lives from those who are powerful, ambitious, or famous through personification. Knowledge and poverty had controlled their growth and expression. From the position of vested talents and possibilities in stanza 14, he smoothly drifts into a related area of unknown, unnoticed gems. He draws examples from nature and humans. He speaks of flowers that come into blushing bloom without a human to see and appreciate their beauty or their sweet scent, and of unsung heroes like the ones buried in the churchyard without monuments or trophies. In the succeeding lines also, he continues to circle around the same position about lives they missed of virtue, and to it in stanza 17, he also adds a remark of the life of crime that they missed. We also come across phrases like village-Hampden, inglorious Milton, Cromwell guiltless, which remarkably fuses talent and the hidden as unknown unsung. In stanza 19, he again moves to a different thought and versifies the blessedness of country life. The lines read, "Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray. Along the cool sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. Thus, the poet is speaking about the blessedness of their life by pointing at the fact that the poor villagers who are buried in the churchyard lived far away from the noise and strife of crowded cities, and so they were able to live their lives without making a lot of unnecessary noise. The poet writes in stanza 20, "Yet even this bones from insult to protect, some frail memorial still erected nigh, with uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculpture decked, implores the passing tribute of a shy." Thus, through this verse, he returns back to the graves with which he began. Here he speaks of the memorials erected over their graves in order to honor the dead. Though those aren't made out of fancy marble, they just have rough, shapeless sculpture to ornament them and are decorated with crude poetry, they still inspire passerby to pause long enough to sigh. The inscription over the memorials don't have an elegy but only has name, date inscribed over them and at time verses from the Bible. Well, I intend to stop here today. The poem is a big one, so I'll leave the remaining 11 stanzas and the epigraphs for my next video. I hope you have understood the stanzas that I have tried explaining today. Read it yourself for further clarification. So this brings us to the end of today's video. Thank you all for joining me.